They all talk of the mysteries of the forest. I've experienced the mysteries of the desert. It was a few years back, and I often don't like to go back to that time. I was experiencing the wonders of Arizona as part of a business trip to partner with an up-and-coming corporation. We had taken a helicopter because the roads were treacherous, and we'd heard of the deadly sandstorm that swept the Sonoran Desert. I was wearing business casual clothes because of the heat. I wanted to stay professional even under a sweltering hot sun. I turned to my coworker and tried to talk to her over the scream of the rotors. "How long will this take?" I yelled. She turned, and unable to communicate her message, simply shrugged. Unable to have any lasting conversation, I turned to look out the window. The sand dunes swept the land for miles, a never-ending sea of beige, punctured by small shadows of straggling clouds. There were several dead shrubs and cacti dotting the rolling sands. In the distance was the roar of a sandstorm, slowly approaching. I didn't hold any fear, however. We were well above the dust. We were flying for about 15 minutes before the sandstorm was under us, cascading over the sand and obscuring the ground from view. It was as endless as the desert itself. Where it had seemed like an arrowhead before, it was suddenly oceanic, as if we were flying above clouds instead of below. There seemed to be no end to it. I was sympathetic for anyone who might have gotten trapped in that storm. An hour passed. I'd gotten worried. We were no closer to our destination, and no closer to the edge of the storm. It had kept going strong for that entire hour. My coworker had fallen asleep about a half hour before, unaware of the circumstances. Tension grew every second. I tried talking to the pilots over the din of the blades, but they never heard me. Those giant headphones must have been a blessing. We got smaller ones to wear, and they weren't nearly as effective. Another half hour passed. By this point I was starting to feel drowsy. A bit of turbulence rocked the chopper a bit, and my coworker slumped onto me, her head on my shoulder. I ignored it. What I didn't ignore was the co-pilot slumping over his seat as well. Suddenly I was wide awake and panicking. I shook the pilot, who never responded. My panic multiplied when his hand slipped off the cyclic control. My rocking woke my coworker, who jolted awake. She tried to ask me what was wrong, but her words were no more than a whisper. I pointed to the pilots, and her eyes widened. Then she pointed to the fuel gauge. It was nearly empty. It seemed we were in the heart of the storm, where the sand twisted and spun and sprayed every which way. If the helicopter dropped, we would never find our way out. I groped around for a parachute, and we found 2 bags under the seats. I gave one to my coworker, and we quickly strapped them on. We were afraid to leave the helicopter, however, glancing down at the storm and saying prayers. It was when the helicopter dipped that we made our decision. We leaped out of the dropping helicopter and opened our parachutes as early as possible. That was a mistake. As soon as we reached the howling hot wind in the sandstorm, we were thrown around like rag dolls, flipping and spinning in zero visibility. I flailed about, trying to right myself, with no avail. I was still dropping. I expected to hit the ground soon, but I never did for another 5 minutes. The winds caught the parachute and dragged me around like a cat would for a mouse. I was falling, just falling. I felt sleepy as I fell farther. My eyes were tightly shut, so it wasn't hard to fall asleep. I just kept falling, pelted by the drum of the sandstorm. I fell, and I fell asleep, and I fell some more. I never noticed when I touched the ground. I was asleep. But when I came to, it was extremely dark, and the sandstorm didn't do anything. I couldn't see past a cactus about 4 feet away. I got up and was immediately yanked back several feet as my parachute caught another strong wind. I struggled to unclip the ties, but eventually it released. The parachute glided away, unimpeded by dead weight. I raced as fast as I could through the storm, which was about turtle's pace. Any sound I made was either shoved back into my throat with a seasoning of sand, or carried away so I would never hear it. The sand felt like stones at this point, pelting my clothes. I didn't want to know what would happen to my skin, so I didn't take them off. I turned around with the wind to my back. I noticed the cactus. I'd barely moved 10 feet away from it. extremely slow progress. As I stood in thought, trying to ignore the sting of the sand, movement caught my eye. The cactus was shifting, but not at the top. It was moving along the ground, surfing towards me slowly, without any care for the wind. I stumbled backward, trying my best to force myself to the shearing winds, but the cactus kept moving just slightly quicker. I began to think I was hallucinating from dehydration. Cacti don't move, I thought, but those deadly long spines. I shook my head and slowed my pace, relaxing a bit and accepting the cactus as a simple mirage, my mind playing tricks on me. It wasn't until a spine stuck into my skin that I truly began to run. Pain shot through my arm, poison corrupting my muscles until it hung limply at my side. I put every ounce of energy I had into running. I spared a glance back. And of course, it was always moving slightly faster. I let a small gasp escape my lips. I tried to run faster, but the wind was just too powerful, slowing me down and letting the cactus stalk me. Without warning, I tumbled down a sand dune. While it was painful because of the sharp grains of sand, I rolled down the slope much faster. I just kept rolling, letting it happen. Finally, I stopped rolling. I could just barely see the green of the cactus, far away, but it was still approaching. Sand started to cover my body. I'd exhausted myself running, so I didn't try to clear it off. 2 layers covered my body. 3, 4. Sharp exhales cleared some breathing room, and I kept my eyes to slits. The cactus approached. I realized that trapping myself was a terrible idea. I held my breath, hoping to every god that I would not die to a cactus. Interestingly, it glided over me, its roots gently sliding past my buried frame. It crawled to a group of 4 cacti surrounding something. It was lumpy, and didn't belong with the pale setting. It wasn't far, only about 2 yards or so, but with the low visibility, I couldn't see what it was. I could only guess. That is, until I saw the parachute. I inhaled sharply in distress. I could identify the red splotches where the cacti pricked her limp form. The parachute was ripped as well, no longer able to catch weaker drafts. I didn't want to try and get closer. As I watched my stalker prick its needles into my coworker, I started to shift the sand off my body. As I hurried, I noticed them getting bigger, bulkier, as if they were feeding off her body. I shakily stood up, once again bracing the gritty gales. I turned away from the cacti and ran, suddenly aided by the wind to my back. I turned back and saw the cacti. They were uprooting themselves. Their roots no longer slid underground, but glided over the sand, allowing them to move so much faster. They'd grown massive, nearly 14 feet in height. I gave a small yelp and pressed myself to run to anywhere but there. I don't know how long I ran for. I encountered slower cacti on my run, cacti too slow to catch me, but I could tell from the haunting sounds behind me that the bigger ones still followed my trail. So I kept running. I was tiring out. My throat was drier than the desert itself. I couldn't lift my arms and my legs were non-existent. But I knew I couldn't rest, not until I found some kind of shelter. I could just barely hear the slithering tendrils of cacti behind me under the dull, constant sand. I wouldn't want to stop and listen, though. That would give them extra time. My feet hit solid pavement, a refreshing change of ground from the fluid sand. I gave as quiet a sound of joy as my throat could muster and changed direction, following the blue-black trail of asphalt. I continued to hobble forward as my feet burned. Sand washed over the road, sometimes making me slip, but I never lost pace. I hoped the hard stone of the path would injure the roots of the cacti as they tried to follow me. I could still hear their tentacle roots snaking around, following my trail. But I began to hear something else. A whisper at first, but getting louder and louder, soon becoming a pulsing groan. Breathing. Deep, bone-jarring breathing. I strained as the sandstorm became ever more powerful, beating my battered body with every blade of wind that passed. The breathing was shattered by a rumbling growl. On the side of the road were 2 small lights, gleaming through the darkness and sand. They peered directly into my soul, inflicting a toxic fear that convinced my body to paralyze itself. The lights shifted and grew brighter. No, closer. The lights became eyes. Eyes inside the hollow carcass of a cactus with 4 legs, each with their own roots carving the sand. On each side of a broad, prickly torso were two thick arms that dragged on the ground behind it. The eyes lay inside dark holes carved into the cactus. The groans emanated from deep inside the beast, aimed towards me. My body screamed as I forced it into gear, stumbling and running as fast as the wind would let me to escape. I could hear the behemoth rushing after me, a juggernaut with the sand at its disposal. I refused to look back at those dreadful glowing eyes. The four legs pounded the sand, shaking the ground as I tumbled blindly. The four cacti were suddenly in front of me, reaching forward, hoping to make a meal out of my flesh. I screamed silently and pivoted, rushing the other way. Those horrible eyes were still visible. A thud shook the ground and I trembled, trying to regain my balance. My feet found the road again and I twisted to follow its path. The eyes. They were in front of me now, accompanied by the same forceful groan as the heavy arms dragged towards me like spiked maces. I left the road and stumbled around as my body begged for sweet water. The roars and rumbles started to fade, until the only unnatural sound was the slither of cactus roots following prey. Normally, loud noises are what wake people up, but in this case, it was the quiet that woke me. I had succumbed to the voice of sleep, and when I blinked the exhaustion out of my eyes, I noticed that the hole had shrunk. The oasis was lower than it had been, and the numerous tunnels had sealed up. Despite the cavern looking like it had gone through a century of wear, it was still a howling night beyond the entrance. I lifted myself out carefully and peeked around, spying for the cacti. There was one measly little shrub barely poking out of the ground, and that was it. Feeling rested and ready, I braced against the storm, moving towards where I remembered the road was. I truly hoped that the beastly cactus wasn't there anymore, and had chosen to move on and stalk something else. I continued walking for what seemed like eternity, never reaching any sort of landmark or even the road. Either I had gone the wrong way, or the entire desert had shifted while I slept. I chose a random direction, hoping that I would manage to reach somewhere, a proper shelter with food. Seeing the little mouse chowing down on the shrub leaf had made me rather hungry. I limped for what seemed like hours. The landscape never seemed to change as I walked miles and miles. While the sandstorm never ceased, it seemed like it was trying to let up. My visibility had gone from barely seeing my hand in front of my face to seeing nearly a mile away. I took full advantage of this blessing, doing 360s every so often to make sure I didn't miss anything. It was one of these times when I hit the jackpot. There was a glint in the distance, a metallic sheen. I wasted no time turning to brace the storm as it hit my flank. Despite the still heavy sting of the sand, I pushed forward, hope flaring in every inch of my body. It never seemed so far, though. A familiar growl pierced my thoughts, taking my attention away from the glimmer. Those two deadening eyes peered at me, paired with a low, guttural growl. The four legs carried the beast closer and closer towards me, never resting as the two massive arms threatened to crush me flat. I stumbled backwards and started running without missing a beat. My arms flailed as the giant created tremors in his pursuit of me. I ran towards the glint. Surely it was some kind of shelter. I hoped. The more I stared at the glint, though, the more an inconsistency with the land became apparent. The land directly in front of me didn't move like the land farther away. There was a certain line where it seemed to divide. With quick realization, I slipped and halted just before the steep drop of a sandstone cliff. Sand slid down like an avalanche, like a sandalanche. Funny how one thinks of the wildest things before death. Another roar silenced my thoughts. I scrabbled back a little, immediately forgetting about the ledge behind me and nearly falling. Although, that would be a far more comfortable way to go. The beast groaned and it leaped, its massive arms spinning like rotors. Time slowed. The cactus seemed weightless. Its eyes, those unnerving eyes. My hand found something thick and sharp in my pocket. It was cylindrical, pointed at the top and colored black with gold rings. It was a pen, one of the pens the company required we carry. Without any thought, I flung it at the creature with terrible aim. I wasn't sure, but something like laughter flashed across the creature's eyes. The wind, however, decided to come to my favor for once. The pen rerouted under the strong wind and zipped through the gust faster than I could track it. Miraculously, it scored one of the giant's eyes, one of those dead, anesthetic eyes. It groaned with pain so loud that sand continued flowing off the edge. Its clumsy feet failed to find a hold in the edge of the cliff, and it tumbled away, writhing and flailing. I stared in horror, hearing its terrible bellow as it fell away. I found another way down the cliff face, one much safer than the path I nearly died on. As I trudged around the pillar, I noticed a misshapen lump near its base. The eyes, the rupturing eyes, no longer glowed. I didn't spare it a second glance, and trotted onward, bracing the storm for that strangely familiar glint. The helicopter. It was there. I strained myself. It was just a bit farther away, within reach. I ran into the side of the helicopter and hugged it for dear life. My hand found the handle and pulled it open. I shoved myself inside and slid the door closed. The helicopter was sort of lopsided in the sand, with the tail snapped and some of the blades bent over the chopper's frame. Sand obscured everything past the windshield, and only slight visibility through one of the side windows. I noticed that both the pilot and the co-pilot had left the safety of the helicopter. I shifted myself to the pilot's seat and peered out the side windows. They were there. They approached the helicopter on those snake-like roots, pushing themselves into the metal frame. Their spines snapped off, and a low screech emitted from their stems. Their assault continued. Other cacti began to surround the helicopter, also trying to break in. I took note of two cacti that had bits of white clothes and blood stuck on them. The hair on the back of my neck rose as I turned. Three of the cacti had managed to dent the metal. The bigger cacti extended to the windows. One of the cacti climbed up a rotor that had fallen to the ground. The helicopter was beginning to get crushed. The third mistake I had made that day, the same as before. I trapped myself. I tried to push back, but I wasn't nearly as strong as the cacti assaulting the bird. I shifted around the slowly closing helicopter, claustrophobia setting into every inch of my body, hoping for a way out. The wind died. Sand stopped swirling. The sound of crushing metal halted. I peered out the window. The sandstorm was moving away. The cacti had shrunk and stilled, surrounding the helicopter eerily, but not dangerously. The cactus that had climbed the rotor fell and planted itself into the sand once again. I fell backwards onto the seats, a headache plaguing my mind. I uneasily slid the chopper door open, half expecting the cacti to spring to motion again, crawl into the helicopter and take my life force. They never moved. I gingerly stepped out and limped away. I made slow progress, and my throat was parched, but I walked and walked until I found a road and a small inn near the edge of the desert. I swung the door open and stumbled in, looking around the empty lobby. It was crowded with old, dusty furniture and a small drinks bar equipped with high stools. Slight wind rushed through cracked windows and creaky planks. It was shabby, yet sturdy, and not bad for shelter. I stumbled to the bar and sat down on the sturdiest stool I could find. I put a hand on the counter and waited for a drink.